Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first online lecture for special topics, U.S. history and the Constitution. This is week 9, and today I'm going to be talking about Article 1 of the Constitution, which is the article dealing with the legislative power. Congress, as you know from having read the first part of Seth Lipsky's The Citizen's Constitution, an annotated guide, was endowed with legislative power but not executive power. Even so, congressional representatives were much more powerful than they had been under the Articles of Confederation, and they were now paid by the federal government rather than by the states. Congress also had much expanded military power under the new Constitution, since it could raise and pay for an army and navy and even nationalize state militias when necessary. Madison and others envisioned the federal army being checked by state militias in times of strife. Before the establishment of judicial review as a concept, that is, before the Supreme Court in 1803 in the case of Marbury versus Madison asserted that it was the entity in charge of reviewing legislation for unconstitutionality, the founders planned for both houses of the legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate, to check each other, and the presidency to check both of them, by refusing to either pass laws that were clearly unconstitutional or else refuse to enforce laws that were clearly unconstitutional. But of course, this only works if people don't care, or if people do care about the Constitution first and foremost, and if they don't sort of collaborate across the lines of supposedly separate areas of power. So when the Senate and the President, for example, coordinate ahead of time on issues, that makes it really hard for the legislature and the executive branch to check each other. As your book points out, there are 4 kinds of actions that Congress can take. There's a bill, and you're familiar with the way that a bill works. It needs to pass both houses and then be signed by the president. There is a simple resolution that binds only one house. There's a joint resolution, which is a kind of bill that starts in both houses simultaneously. And then there's a concurrent resolution, which normally just applies to the rules of both houses of Congress, but since 1973 has been used to attempt to bind the president's power in some way. So a good example of a concurrent resolution is the War Powers Resolution of 1973. The concurrent resolution was passed during the Vietnam War, when it was not actually a declared conflict. There has not been a congressional declaration of war since 1941. So this was a resolution had been passed in 1964 after the supposed attack on American shipping in the Tonkin Gulf near Vietnam. Congress had allowed the president to escalate the war, but now they were trying to rein back the president's powers of war making, since this war had dragged on for forever. But despite the fact that Congress passed this War Powers Resolution, which said that only Congress has the right to declare war, and tried to set some boundaries around the actions that a president can take to wage war without the approval of Congress, presidents have never accepted the idea that they can be bound by a concurrent resolution. As a result, the scope of activity pursued by presidents as, quote, commander-in-chief of the armed forces has expanded over time. And if you look at this little cartoon, it explains what the War Powers Act incorporated, that the president had to inform Congress about having deployed troops. Congress had the opportunity to force the president to withdraw troops. Presidents could get a 30-day extension. And then it shows you in the bottom right-hand corner of that particular cartoon the way in which presidents have kind of made an end run around the War Powers Resolution. So what are the responsibilities and rights and powers that both houses of the legislature have? Well, the House of Representatives, as you guys probably remember, has the right to impeach or to bring charges against the president for high crimes and misdemeanors. But the Senate is in charge of then taking those charges and having a trial and deciding whether or not to convict and remove from office. All budget bills start in the House of Representatives, and the reason for that is that very long connection going all the way back to Charles I and ship money, the connection between taxation and representation. That taxation has to be consented to by the people, and that is why, given that only the House of Representatives was directly elected by the people in the early days of the Republic, that is why they were in charge of all budget bills. What Congress jointly does, they regulate some kinds of commerce that is between the states, with foreign nations, and among the Indian tribes. Establish uniform weights and measures. Coin money, so that is to mint coins rather than, at this point, printing paper money. Passing certain kinds of laws, that is laws about bankruptcy, about counterfeiting, about naturalization, or, getting people made into citizens. Congress had the right to constitute inferior courts, that is to create those courts, to borrow money by issuing bonds, to define and punish piracy. And on the left there you see Captain Kidd, who was a famous pirate, being gibbeted. What people would do to pirates is to execute them and then hang their bodies in these cages until they decomposed, which was meant to be a method of deterrence for people who might consider piracy because it was so awful. Congress has the right to declare war, although, as I have pointed out to you, there hasn't been a war declaration since 1941, but there have been plenty of wars since then. So presidents have found ways around the declaration of war process. Congress can issue letters of marque, which letters of marque are kind of privateering licenses that are issued by the government. So during a war, Congress could give owners of ships the right to kind of act as pirates and then prey on enemies in wartime. This is something that is allowed in the Constitution, but has hardly ever been done. Congress can fund and also draft an army, and the first time that the draft was made use of was during the Civil War. It can provide a navy, and a navy was thought to be super important because of the separation of the United States from Europe. And then it could arm and control state militias, even nationalizing those militias when necessary. The thought was that, militias might be a bulwark against the army in case of attempted military coup, but given the differential in firepower between the army and individuals these days, that just wasn't going to happen. One of the very important aspects of congressional power is this right to regulate economic activity. And this is called the Commerce Clause. And the Dormant Commerce Clause is the question of how far this regulation of activity goes. Before the New Deal, before the 1930s, it was generally thought in judicial reasoning that the Commerce Clause didn't apply to any activities that took place within a single state. So things like congressional regulation of child labor were constantly shot down because Congress didn't have the power to regulate those. During the New Deal, the federal government asserted a lot more power over the economy through the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which set rules for various different kinds of business activities. One of these rules was tested in the Schechter poultry case. How it was supposed to work for poultry sellers was they were not supposed to allow their customers to reach into the poultry cage and pick their own chicken. Schechter Poultry was allowing them to do that. And the NIRA regulations, since they said no, Schechter Poultry challenged those regulations. And it seemed like the Supreme Court was going to knock down the entirety of the New Deal on the grounds that this kind of regulation within a single state was unconstitutional. But this was when Franklin Roosevelt said, you know, if you do that, I'm going to add a bunch more Supreme Court justices to the court, and the Supreme Court at that point backed down. Over time, the court has developed a 3-category framework for analyzing Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. A regulation is constitutional under the Commerce Clause if it regulates interstate commerce, that is, commerce between two states, instrumentalities of interstate commerce, so things like buses, trains, trucks. And the third is an interesting one, economic or commercial intrastate activities that in the aggregate have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. In the 1942 case of Wickard versus Filburn, the Supreme Court upheld a legal prohibition on growing wheat for your own use. Here's this guy, Roscoe Filburn. He was growing wheat that he was not planning on bringing to market. He was growing it just for his family's own personal use. And the Supreme Court reasoned that he could be blocked from doing this because if everybody did that, if everybody created wheat for their own personal use, then there would be terrible market effects. So interstate commerce would be affected. The court rejected in Wickard the use of, quote, mechanical applications of legal formulas. It held that Congress had the authority under the Commerce Clause to regulate any activity that had a substantial effect on interstate commerce. The court also said that it's kind of like what Immanuel Kant said about whether or not a activity is ethical. If everyone were to do it, what would be the effects of that activity? And here the court made that same kind of analysis, saying, although Mr. Filburn's activities alone may not substantially affect the interstate market for wheat, quote, his contribution taken together with that of many others similarly situated is far from trivial. So there was this aggregation question about whether or not Congress could regulate intrastate commerce. Much later, like within the past 3 decades, there has been a similar court case that said that that's the reason why you cannot grow your own marijuana. It's because if you do so, if everyone were to do that, that would impact the interstate market for marijuana, which is kind of an odd thing to argue given that it's not legal. But that is something that the Supreme Court decided under the Commerce Clause. Beginning again in the 1980s, some jurists on the Supreme Court tried to peel back the Commerce Clause to what they thought the original intention of the framers was, which was an extremely limited realm of economic activity. The main issue that they came up with was the exclusivity question. That is, did the framers intend for only Congress to be able to regulate commerce, Or was there also some part of the commerce regulating power that was reserved to the states? Attention to the writings of Hamilton and Madison shows that one of their main concerns was trying to get the states to think more continentally on matters of trade. For example, New York's port was charging import duties to ports in Connecticut and New Jersey. So ports in Connecticut and New Jersey opened up their ports as free ports to try to steal some of the business from New York. And in the case of Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional for one state to be able to grant a ferry monopoly over a stretch of water that separated two states. So this should kind of shove the Supreme Court in the direction of thinking that, yes, Hamilton and Madison and other framers were trying to argue for an exclusive power for the regulation of commerce in Congress. However, that doesn't foreclose states from all kinds of commercial regulation. That is accomplished under a different power, the quote, police power, by which states are empowered to protect health, welfare, and the morals of their inhabitants. In terms of recent uses of the Dormant Commerce Clause, opponents of the Affordable Care Act of 2010 successfully used the Commerce Clause to attack the part of Obamacare that mandated individuals to purchase health insurance. They said, okay, fine, the Commerce Clause can regulate activity that impacts interstate commerce, but it cannot regulate inactivity. And they argued successfully that choosing not to buy health insurance was a form of inactivity rather than a form of activity. I would say this is questionable reasoning because if you don't buy health insurance and then you end up going to the emergency room, then you incur a debt that then other people have to pay or it has to be written off. So your activity or inactivity is part of this larger economic system. But on the other hand, you can see why the court would have a problem with that because it just opens the door to any form of activity or inactivity being regulated. Another part of Article 1, which has a lot of leeway built into it, is the Necessary and Proper Clause. The Necessary and Proper Clause grants Congress the right to legislate on all matters that arise from its enumerated responsibilities. Who decides what's necessary and proper? The court decides what is proper, that is, the power enumerated in the Constitution, and Congress decides on the degree of necessity. Necessary has been taken to mean not absolutely necessary, not the only possible option, but any option that is reasonably convenient or that can stand up to a rational basis test. If you want to look at the Necessary and Proper Clause, you kind of have to start by looking at the case of McCullough versus Maryland from 1819. In this case, the court addressed whether the federal government had the power to incorporate a bank. The creation and chartering of a national bank is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. And so the question was, well, is it an implied power? Does it somehow emanate from the powers that are enumerated? And the court said, yes, the incorporation of a national bank is necessary and proper to the execution of Congress's enumerated powers. So the Necessary and Proper Clause has been used to kind of delineate a scope of implied powers for Congress without which it couldn't actually get done the powers that are in the Constitution. Another more recent example, in 2010, the Supreme Court upheld the power of the government to continue to detain so-called sexually dangerous prisoners after they had completed their prison sentences. The justices said, basically, the detainment is not directly related to enumerated power, but they still upheld the regulation by a 7-2 vote. They said the statute was within Congress's purview of protecting the public, and decided that the statute had a rational basis. That is, you could argue that there was a good reason for the federal government to be kind of stepping into the breach after state governments had exhausted their powers by, holding people in jail or in prison for the entirety of their prison term and then letting them go. At that point, the federal government had the power to step in, is what they decided in U.S. versus Comstock in 2010. In contrast with the Confederation Congress, the House of Representatives Congress delegates were actually elected by the people. Articles of Confederation Congress, people had to meet a high property qualification. There was no property qualification to be a member of the House of Representatives, but because the framers were very suspicious of people who didn't have property, they wanted to make sure that there would be checks on the new Congress. All the states were in charge of setting their own voting rules, and they were not allowed to set property qualifications. But built into the election of the House of Representatives was a system of census and congressional reapportionment. So every 10 years there's a census, and the number of House of Representatives members from each state is adjusted depending on the number of residents in each state. This was a reaction to the British system, which had basically failed to do any kind of reapportionment over centuries, and the result of that was rotten boroughs like Old Sarum, which had maybe 5 voters living in it, and towns like Manchester and Leeds having absolutely no parliamentary representation whatsoever. There weren't any bars against naturalized citizens serving in Congress. This was also new because there was a bar against naturalized citizens serving in Parliament. The state residency requirement was made to prevent the kind of carpetbagging often seen in British corrupt boroughs, where somebody would want a seat in Parliament and it would be for some place they didn't even live. And so they would go to a friend of theirs who had control of a rotten borough and say, "Hey, can I be the MP here?" And they would pull the strings and that person would get to be the MP. Another thing that was incorporated into the House of Representatives that was different from what happened in Parliament was you needed a supermajority for either house to expel a member, whereas in Parliament you only needed a simple majority. And the simple majority was problematic because John Wilkes, who was this sort of radical Whig, was duly elected to Congress, and then he was excluded due to his radically Whiggish views. He was sort of anti-George III, wasn't really doing anything seditious, but Parliament didn't want him in there, and so by a simple majority he was expelled, much to the chagrin of the people who had voted for him. The actual number of representatives specified in the first Congress was small, and anti-federalists worried that the small size of Congress would make Congress insufficiently diverse. But then after a while, Congress grew to where we have it today, where there are 435 members, much larger than the original 80 or so. At right here, you see part of Congress's role to establish rules for uniform naturalization. This is the Naturalization Act of 1790 that there's a section of here. And it says, any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the U.S. for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. So the sort of racial bar to admission to citizenship existed from the very beginning of the nation's history. In contrast with the House of Representatives, senators were chosen by state legislatures. They represented, quote, the people of the states, going back to that formulation that I talked about last week, or the last time we met, where really they're representing the states. But they didn't want to say in the Constitution, oh, the states have the power. So the people of the states had the power. This made the Senate sort of at one remove from popular election all the way up until 1913 when the 17th Amendment provided for direct election of senators. And that was incorporated as a kind of progressive attack on what was happening with senators, which was that lobbies, very powerful corporate lobbies within the states were having total control over the election of senators. And you can kind of see that here. The bosses of the Senate. Standard Oil Trust, the Copper Trust, the Steel Beam Trust, etc. Okay, so I would love to discuss some of these issues more with you guys in the discussion part of this week's class. Please do raise any questions there, and I wish I could be there in person with you and see you in the comments. All right.